The Pacers offseason is underway and going, but the Fever season is just starting, which is a perfect time to kind of assess both teams, see what paths they're on in rebuilding, and compare them, seeing which one may be better, maybe worse, and see where these teams are headed. We'll do it all today on the Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in to another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers as always. My name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and the Westside Community News, and today I am changing the name of the podcast to Locked On Pacers Sports and Entertainment because we are going to venture into Feverland today. We're going to talk Pacers, how their season shook out, where they may be headed. The Fever, who just drafted 7 players and are headed down a way different path after their GM retired this season, and kind of compare the paths of both franchises going forward. And joining me to do that, okay, how much time do I have to do this? Let's see. Pacers radio host, Pacers sideline reporter, fills in on 1075, does TV play-by-play, does the Fever play-by-play, does Bally Sports stuff for the Pacers. Pat Boylan, as you may know him. Pat, did I get all of it in there?
I think you got all of it, and you should have asked me beforehand, because what I just tell people to say is Pacers and Fever broadcaster, and I could have saved you some breath, some words there. But, it's good to talk with you here, Tony. There's not a ton of people that cover both the Pacers and the Fever, but you are one of them, and you do a great job. So I'm looking forward to having this discussion on both teams.
You are also one of them, which makes this the perfect conversation. It's a very interesting time for both teams. The Pacers just wrapped up their third worst season in franchise history. The Fever coming off of their worst 2-season stretch in franchise history. So both teams certainly looking to grow next season with a lot of newness going on in both franchises. We'll start with the Pacers, as this is a Pacers show, but really this will all be kind of about both. But it's a big picture from a Pacers perspective. You stood on the sidelines for many of these games, broadcasted all of them, obviously. What stood out to you about this Pacers season beyond that just they were really crummy, right? That was the third worst season they've had, but they've also had a unique season this year. They never make in-season trades. They played 30 guys this season. What kind of stood out to you about this team this year as they stumbled through it?
Well, I think unique is probably a good word. There were so many aspects of this season that just didn't exist in previous years. And you start with just a return to close to normalcy, and then what felt like just about a normal NBA world by the end of it, coming back from the COVID protocol. So just the opportunity to be sideline and to be able to hear the sights and the sounds, that was taken away from us last season and the bubble restart portion of the season before. So from my perspective, that was extremely welcomed. And then you just had so much uniqueness in a season. You had Rick Carlisle coming back, which I was thrilled and even a little bit surprised that the Pacers were able to make that happen. But clearly he had, dyed roots in the Pacers community and in Indianapolis, and viewed those previous stops so positively that he wanted to come back. And then, really when you think back to the season, the couple of themes that stick out to me are just the kind of two eras of the team. Obviously things didn't get started on the right foot with the start to the season. And I remember on the podcast that Jeremiah Johnson and I do, kind of feeling like December was going to be the make it or break it month. They had a ton of home games, and they really needed to take care of business then. And they did okay, but they weren't able to, I think, in the way that it was necessary to get their season back on track. So it did kind of feel like going into the trade deadline that this would be the year, if there was going to be one, where the Pacers were active at the deadline. But of course, Indiana had so many players that I think were desirable to other franchises that it was tough to know exactly how that might look. And really from the point of the trade on, it kind of felt like a completely different season with Tyrese Halliburton and Buddy Hield coming in, Tristan Thompson for a little bit, Karis LeVert on his way out. And so it never really felt to me like the season ever got on track. And then when you had the big trade, the rest of the year was just kind of these guys trying to fit in and find themselves for the remainder of the season. So because of that, it never really felt like the season had a flow to it. But obviously, as we will discuss here on this podcast, I think there's more than reasonable hope that the frustrations that the season brought from not getting the type of wins or on-floor success that you would hope actually could end up being a silver lining and pay dividends in future years.
Yeah, you hit a lot of stuff that I think I haven't even talked about that much. One of them being December, because Look, the sign should have been there 2 days into the season that this Pacers season was going to be weird when they lost both of their first 2 games by 1 point. But they went 500 in November. They got LeVert back that month, and then you said, their December schedule finally got a little easier, a lot more home games. Game 1, McConnell gets hurt. Game 4, 5, Brogdon gets hurt. Carlisle goes down with COVID. So then they have their assistant coach filling in. Then the whole rest of the team has COVID all at the same time, right? Like right when it was a chance for this team to hey, we just had a good month. Let's keep going. It all just fell apart. And in past seasons, you could kind of compartmentalize the Pacers season into 2 or 3 parts, right? Pre-Vic, post-Vic, or pre-injury, post-injury, or pre-trade, post-trade. This year, it was 7 parts. It was the beginning, and then they get one guy back, and then the part we just talked about in December, and then pre-deadline, and then post-deadline, and then post-buy. It was all just a mess and confusing, and not a team that ever had enough pieces together to be any good, and it really all fell apart in that December, January timeframe before they had decided they had to make all the changes. So they have a good pick now. They have kind of an idea of who they are and who they want to be this offseason. Obviously, critically important for this franchise. Do you feel like they can jump back up into that play-in playoff spot next year? Do you think they need a little bit more time before they get back up there? Because I was planning on writing the story about the Cavs, who were 13th in the East in 2021 and then jumped into the playoffs, and then they blew in the play-in, and now that article is stupid. But do you feel like the Pacers have the potential to do what the Cavs could not do this year and make that jump?
It's not necessarily stupid from the aspect of Cleveland has a pretty good blueprint of, I think, one way that you can do this. They lost LeBron James and their bottom fell out, and they were able to draft one pick very high, one pick moderately high, and they hit on both of those guys. And they've done a nice job of mixing veterans around. And look, it took them a few years. Don't get me wrong. This wasn't the very next year after their first year struggling. They were back in the spotlight. But look, that was a Cavs team that a couple of years ago, before the play-in tournament existed, makes the playoffs. And so I think it was a successful year for them, even though they unfortunately, especially for Pacers fans, unfortunately didn't make the playoffs. But I think this is the most fascinating Pacers offseason that I can remember. And I think it's because, and Kevin Pritchard alluded to this in his press conference right after the trade deadline, there are just he was using a comparison to a ship, and there are just so many directions the ship could go. And I mean, think about it, right? The Pacers could have the number 1 pick in the draft. The Pacers could have the number 8th pick in the draft. Technically 9 is possible. It's a less than 1% chance, so I'm not even going to, go there. But the difference between, first of all, picking 1 and 8 is dramatically different in how you view the draft. And so when you look at the numerous different avenues and analogies you can make to other teams, I think it's really challenging to do so before May 17th. Once the draft lottery hits, are the Pacers picking 4th? Are they picking 6th? And it seems to me, I'm not well-versed in the draft, but I do read up on the college game and try to look at mock drafts and stuff like that. It seems like there's maybe a dividing line after 4 amongst tiers. So I just think there's so much still to be figured out there that it's tough to exactly know that path. And then the other thing, and this is something that I think Kevin Pritchard has done a very good job of, is I don't think he's going to go into this trying to force any one specific narrow path. I think he's done a good job of, who would have guessed that the Karis LeVert trade would happen? Who would have guessed that the Pacers would be part of a James Harden deal, right? But they kept their ears to the ground. They found a way to get in there. They found a way to get something out of Oladipo, which, he was trending in the wrong direction, and the Pacers were able to move him at a time where they could still get some value for him. So I think a lot of this is kind of based on the market, right? What interest do other teams have in your own veterans? Are the Pacers actively shopping them? I have no idea. But if some team comes to you with an offer you can't refuse for a guy, well, then that could, kind of change your trajectory as well. And I think the other thing that could be interesting here, and Kevin Pritchard has talked about this more generically, not necessarily this offseason or with any specific move. And Tony, you could speak to this better than just about anybody that I know, but the Pacers will have a ton of cap space. So Kevin Pritchard has brought up the point, well, you can take on a contract that another team is desperately trying to get rid of, and you can get a couple of assets for that if you're willing to absorb a bad deal, if you have the cap space to do so. So do they look in that direction? all that to say, all those angles are so fascinating, but they're impossible to predict. And just, how much do the Pacers, how much movement do they make? And are they going for long-term type of assets, young players and draft picks? Or, I mean, that draft pick's going to have value too. And if there were, maybe a veteran out there, I have no idea. But wherever the Pacers pick, it's going to be valuable if they wanted to, even look in that direction. So I don't predict that's going to happen. I think it would take something spectacular to get the Pacers to get out of their pick, because they haven't had a pick this high in so long. But it's just another example of the numerous ways the ship could go. And I think it's just too hard to predict until I think once you see that first domino fall of the draft lottery, then I think you might be able to narrow your window a little bit more. But right now, I think it's just too challenging to know, and it obviously makes May 17th a massive day for Pacers fans.
It does. That's a good way to put it, that it's kind of hard to determine. And that's why I think the ship analogy is pretty good in general, is because there are so many directions they could go. He used the ship analogy probably a dozen times in 30 minutes. It kept making me laugh at the end when he would bring up the ship and pointing in a new direction. The other factor in that, to me, is that look, it's a little different because they don't actually have the pick, but they still have this asset of the Cavs pick too. It's like they could use that to slide all around on all over the place. And they've never come in with like the kind of, in the Pritchard era, at least I should say, when I've been really tracking this stuff, they never come into an offseason with this type of ammo. Now, obviously, they have all this ammo because they had a crappy season, but that does make it a little easier to kind of direct whatever path you want to go. Maybe if they're in the top 4, they do try to be good next year. Maybe if they're not, they not take a gap year or anything like that. But, what they do is a little softer than, and not as aggressive. Who knows? But I do think they have a lot of options in answering the question of, can they jump back up to having a season like the Cavs this year? It might depend on getting that top 4 pick. If the Cavs don't jump into 3 and get Mobley last year, they're probably not in that discussion, right? Him getting hurt actually is part of the reason the Pacers don't have an extra first-round pick this year. So that kind of stuff all ties in hand. Now let's flip to the other team. Hey guys, let's take one short little break, talk about 2 wonderful groups of people. First up, the good folks over at PrizePicks. Are you looking for a daily fantasy option for the NBA? Then you've got to try the award-winning app PrizePicks. It's daily fantasy made easy. I love it. I know that you will too. What is it? It's easy to use. You pick 2 to 5 players and an over-under on their projections for stats on a given day. You can go up to 10 times on any entry. It's just you versus the projected numbers. You make your entries in 60 seconds or less. Super easy. They give you safe and fast withdrawals, and they have an award-winning app. All you do, pick a player, pick any prop you can think of, points scored, rebounds, steals, you name it, they've got it for the player you choose. Will they go over it? Will they go under it? You can do mixed sport entries, NBA, MLB, whatever you like. Those 2 are going on right now. And they don't just have those 2 sports. They've also got college football, college basketball, NFL, MMA, and more. For a limited time, PrizePicks has an exclusive no-brainer of an offer. For all of our users, just sign up. You'll get $50 for free if a player in your first entry scores a single point, but you got to use the code NBA when you sign up. That's right, exclusive offer for Locked On fans. Sign up today on PrizePicks. Use the code NBA, $50 for free if a player in your first PrizePicks entry scores a single point. PrizePicks, daily fantasy made easy. Let's also talk about BetOnline.net, your number 1 source for all your sports betting stats and sports info. You can find all the latest developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's basketball playoffs and the start of the Major League Baseball season over at BetOnline.net. They've got all the odds up for games, 2s, and 3s up for the NBA. The Grizzlies favored by 7 over Minnesota. Very interesting after the way that first game went. I'll be definitely tuning in to that one. And BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sports wagering information, from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. Head over to the website today or use your mobile device to sign up. Learn more about the trends in the action over at BetOnline.net. BetOnline is where the game starts. Currently going through a crazy draft night. For comparison's sake, this isn't perfect because the roster sizes are different. But the Fever, for those of you who are unaware, just picked 7 players in the draft last week. And there are 36 picks. That's 1/5 of the draft. That's like an NBA team picking about 12 players in one draft for a 15-man roster. That, again, doesn't work perfectly because the roster sizes are different. But they had an insane draft night, Melissa Smith being the highlight of it at the second pick. Pat, what did you think of the Fever draft, and what do you kind of think of the direction they're heading now? Because from my seat, Melissa is the most exciting prospect they've had with their lottery picks they've had for the last few years.
Since I think I should say. I do think that's accurate. I think I would put personally Melissa Smith on that Kelsey Mitchell line, in that you draft a player that, look, you want to keep going to the ship analogy. I mean, there are just so many there are just so many possible, I think, avenues for her as well. Like if you told me that Nalissa Smith was, got all the way up to being a superstar in this league, it would take some things like a 3-point shot falling, but it wouldn't shock me. And so a player like her, I think, is somebody that's hopefully a lot more WNBA ready, and that tends to be the case for a lot of players in the WNBA because they can't come out. In some cases, they can after their junior year, but in the vast majority of cases, it's after your senior year. So you do get a player that's one of the positives here is the Fever. They're in a tough position, being 6-26 last year. But unlike in the NBA, where unless you're getting oftentimes one of the top couple of picks, you're like, okay, maybe in a couple of years this guy could be ultimately really helpful. I think there's reasonable expectation on, although you don't want to put too much pressure on her, but on Nalissa Smith being somebody who can be impactful right away. So from a WNBA draft standpoint, no team has ever picked 4 times in the first round. So there was history there. I think when you make the comparisons to the NBA, important to point out too that like the 10th pick in the NBA is a lot more valuable than the 10th pick in the WNBA
Right.
because only 12 teams. So like the comparison I was making was if you want to look at these picks from somebody who's used to the NBA, which I know is a lot of your audience, it was something along the lines of maybe if an NBA team had like picks 2, 8, 15, and 25. Which is still an awesome haul. Don't get me wrong, but just the way the leagues work are different because there's only 12. Right. The 10th pick is closer to the end of the first round than the beginning. That said, Lynn Dunn, I think went in a lot of different directions here. Like Nalissa Smith is going to be the most important thing that comes out of this draft, and whether the Fever hit on 4, 6, and 10, and 20, and maybe even further down, that's important. But like ultimately, to me, the success of the Fever hinges mostly on, at least the success of the Fever as it relates to this draft, hinges mostly on what type of player Nalissa Smith can be. Because all of these other players, I think obviously you don't get picked 4th in a draft unless you have a lot of potential. But Nalissa is the one player that has the potential to be a real game changer. And when I think back to other Fever drafts, Kaiser Gondrzick wasn't that. Lauren Cox was billed as a more top flight player than I think, unfortunately, she turned out to be. But even then, I think if you would have asked most WNBA draft analysts, college basketball experts, whomever, Lauren Cox or Nalissa Smith, they'd take Nalissa Smith. Tiara McCowan was a very intriguing prospect and somebody who turned out to be, a pretty good, if not still a bit inconsistent pro. And the Fever traded her, somewhat coincidentally, to get one of these picks we're talking about. But in terms of ceiling, Nalissa Smith and what she becomes, I think, is going to be the most important thing. And I think from a Fever perspective, as much as anything, you need a secondary scorer to go with Kelsey Mitchell. I think, as big of a Kelsey Mitchell fan as there is. She's a really dynamic offensive guard who just can score in so many ways. But what you would see, I think, happen a lot last year is Fever just didn't have a secondary score to go with her. And because of that, I mean, her 3-point number suffered because teams could crowd her on the 3-point line and put 2 bodies at her, and she was the focal point of every defense. And that's really challenging. So, what I'm really hopeful here for is that Nalissa is able to provide not only a secondary scoring option that makes the Fever more dynamic, and you see a significant step forward this year because of Nalissa, and she starts to have the looks of a player that's going to blossom into a star. But I also think there's a real chance that there's something untapped there in Kelsey Mitchell that, to use a comparison to another player who has some Indiana ties, like Jewel Lloyd is a terrific player in Seattle who gets to play.
I love her. She's so good.
Yeah, and she gets to play with Sue Bird and Brianna Stewart, right? So, like, she doesn't have the issue that Kelsey Mitchell has. And so I tend to think that there's something in Kelsey that we haven't been able to see yet just because they haven't been able to develop that second go-to player. And I think ultimately that's what you're hoping that Nalissa becomes. And then, Lynn Dunn, and some of this work was done by Tamika Catchings too, are very clearly still centered around and have their eyes around the 2023 draft as well. So I'm hoping when we're talking a year from now or so that the Fever have a couple more high picks in 2023, although obviously you certainly want to see some improvement from the Fever in their own team this year.
Yeah, Dunn has been interesting about her comments about this team because she day one, first presser, she's like, yes, Kelsey Mitchell, franchise centerpiece, stamp, done, I'm there. And I agree, she's very good. She got the Team USA invite for a reason. But I agree with you too that to do that, they would have to get a lot of important stuff. And the free agency was like basically done, right? So for Dunn to get the stuff that to me would be needed to help Kelsey Mitchell be a better franchise centerpiece, the draft is really important. And so to me, one, Alyssa, if she's as W ready as she looks like she could be, that will help with, like you said, being a release valve or being a secondary option that makes it harder for defenses too. Lexi Hall, if they play together, the best shooter the Fever have had, uh, maybe 4 years. I mean, a while. And Betty is awesome if she comes over this year at the 5, and Queen Egbo as a defender is really helpful, and then Emily Engsler, who I'm the biggest fan of ever. I think is a great fit as like a secondary creator and the best perimeter defender they may have had in a while. Losing a bunch of weight going from Syracuse to Louisville made her perimeter defense excellent. That's something she talked about right after the draft, right? So in terms of Kelsey Mitchell is our core player, we're building around her, like home run draft for the Fever to me. Now, did they pick who everybody thought they'd pick? No, but from the core standpoint of we think Kelsey Mitchell's a franchise player, I think they did a very good job there. And I think something that Lynn Dunn said is this season, before Tamika stepped down in mid-February, she said playoffs were the goal this coming season. And when I talked to Danielle Robinson this offseason, she said the same thing. Aaliyah Wilson, who they cut, said the same thing. So that I kind of thought that was like the internal goal for a while. And then Lynn Dunn comes in, she's like, no. Get that out of here. Improvement. We want to get better. And I think getting the stuff that fits around their best player and having 7 rookies at the same time is a good recipe to take a step forward. And I really like that team building strategy from the Fever because this is the first time they've had, that they did not do well in the 2021 draft. They had 2 firsts then. Before that, the last time they had 2 firsts was 2018, and they got Kelsey and Vivian's. And that draft looks great in retrospect even. Those 2 players might still be on the team this year, and they're both still talented. So I like the way they did it, picking a core player and saying, if we're going to improve, we need to build around this player. Because if we know we have the pieces around this player. So if it doesn't work, we can make moves next year. And if it does work, great, we have a better team. And 2, to stick to your guns and pick a bunch of rookies in a year you say you want to improve. I thought you did a very good job taking the team from where it was when she inherited it to where it is now.
Yeah, and I agree with all that. And you look at the many different types of players that were brought in. Like, you look at these first 4 picks. No, really, first 5 picks. I mean, everybody is so different. Everybody has a unique skill set. So NaLyssa Smith, you're hoping she's your star. You're hoping she's, your secondary scorer. And who knows? Maybe she gets to the level one day where she's 1A with Kelsey Mitchell. And for the Fever ultimately to be where they want to go, I think there's no doubt that Kelsey Mitchell is, a centerpiece in all of this. But I think you need multiple people performing at least at her level. And I think you need her probably to be able to take another step forward, too. The hopes that NaLyssa Smith is one of those. And then, Engsler is a very different type of player. Like she's probably not going to be scoring 20 points per game in the WNBA. But the Fever defensively, the last couple of years have really struggled. And so, there was an immediate obvious, sign to me that we need to address the defense. So they did that with Engsler. I think NaLyssa Smith's a plus defender. Queen Egbo is a good defender. And then, Hull might not be a shutdown defender, but you're kind of hoping for, I think, a little bit of a 3-and-D presence there. But with Hull, you're getting shooting around Mitchell. With Smith, you're hopefully getting that second primary score with Mitchell. With Engsler, you're getting somebody who can, make life difficult for defenders and help on that side of the floor. And I'm hopeful that she's going to surprise some people on the offensive end. Her shooting efficiency numbers are actually pretty good, and I'm just not sure she ever really got to showcase that. And we see that all the time in the NBA, in the WNBA. How often does a player, get more court space and the ability to do a little bit more? The reins come off a little bit and they develop an offensive game. So I am hopeful there, even though that's probably never going to be her number one calling card. And then with Destiny Henderson, I think you get somebody that frankly they didn't think was going to be there, and so they probably weren't planning around that. But you get a, while undersized, very dynamic guard to go in the backcourt. So I think, to me, the most interesting thing of this draft is, does NaLyssa Smith eventually become the dynamic type of player that can, move the franchise forward, like I think many of us hope that she can be. But then also you have so many different type of players, stylistically, just their different skill sets, that how all of that forms together with their current group, I think will be really interesting to watch this year. And I'll say, since Tamika Catchings hung up her uniform from her playing days, I would say this is probably the most optimistic I've been about the Fever. And that's not to suggest that they're going to even make the playoffs next year, but it does suggest, like, I'm looking at the roster right now and I go, okay, you can definitely see the path forward here, and a realistic path forward
Bingo.
to getting to where you want to be. And then we'll see. The Fever could have a couple of high draft picks and a loaded class in a following year too, which, if that were to happen, could continue to vault them in the direction that hopefully, you can certainly see the vision that's in place right now.
One more break here, guys, so I can tell you about the good folks over at Rock Auto. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why endure often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning about your vehicle and its specs, and then wait while the guy behind the counter orders all the parts on their computer, choosing only the brand that their warehouse happens to carry? You have computers with access to rockauto.com at your home or in your pocket, and you can save time and money while using Rock Auto. Why would you choose to spend 30%, 50%, even 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or car dealership when you can get it for cheaper at Rock Auto, a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 2 decades? Their prices are always reliably low for every customer, and they have everything you could need: brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, even new carpet. You've got to try it out yourself. Explore their easy-to-use website today. Find the solution to your auto parts needs. Go to rockauto.com right now. See all the parts available for your car or truck, right? Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box, so they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need at rockauto.com. Yeah, maybe 2020, but not even really then. But you kind of just said it. Like, this is the most sense the Fever roster has made to me since Tamika retired. Like, I get it now. I get the stuff fits together. The pieces are there. The future assets are still there. Like, I get it. And I like that they're thinking improvement. I like the way Lynn Dunn thinks and operates. I think she'll be good in her tenure with Indiana, however long that lasts. And so to see it all come together, and a lot of the eggs are in the Alyssa Smith basket now, but she does project to be very good. And she's good enough that Lynn Dunn was going on TV and the radio like a week before the draft. She's like, "Yeah, we're gonna pick Melissa or Ryan Howard." Like, I'm not gonna pretend like this is some mystery with the second pick. Like, I'm telling you all, we're picking one of those two players. So I like the way she operates. I like where that team is headed now, especially compared to where they were even at the beginning of this offseason, where it looked like they might be running it back a little bit more than they end up doing so. So to tie this in to the Pacers, like Lynn Dunn using the word "we're going to improve" to the way she sent up the team, I thought was fascinating. So now, as the Pacers head into this draft where they have a guy in Halliburton who maybe you want to build around, and improvement's got to be a big goal after you get to a bottom 3 season in franchise history. What kind of, I mean, maybe they end up taking a similar path, but do you feel like the longer rebuild makes more sense for one team or not the other team? How do you compare the kind of path that they're on going forward?
It's a good question, because both are in positions. We'll see here with the draft lottery, but both are in positions where you have a guard that you're planning on building around, different scenarios and how you got that guard and who that guard is and the ceiling and all of that. And then a high draft pick for the Fever and what will be a single-digit draft pick for the Pacers, but hopefully we're talking about a top 4 draft pick. And again, I think all of that from the draft lottery kind of determines a lot of the path that you go. And from a Pacers perspective, I think it's a little too early necessarily to give any prognostication on, how this team might even look, let alone how quick they can perform, what type of, whether it's a rebuild or, whether it's a reset or whatever words you want to use there. But
I've heard every word in the last 6 months with the Pacers. So whatever you pick, go ahead. Yeah.
But I think the one thing, like, as I look at where the Pacers are right now, they've got a player that I think I feel safe saying this is the most exciting, intriguing, and this doesn't necessarily come from where he is right now, although he is very exciting and intriguing right now. But since Paul George, I can't remember the Pacers having a guy that was as exciting and as intriguing as this. And they're very, very different players. But especially when you consider, no, don't get me wrong, when Victor Oladipo came in here, there was a ton of excitement and a lot of intrigue. And I don't want to necessarily wash that away just because his ending here and the unfortunate injuries were negative. Like, what Victor Oladipo did in 2017, 2018 was awesome, period. But what Halliburton, I think, could be at his age right now is fascinating, because while the Pacers, definitely took a step back from a record perspective. They definitely didn't get anywhere near the win total that they wanted. They've got a guy here that I think we're still waiting to see how good he can be. But like when you're top 4 in assists over like a 30-game period with the franchise as a 22-year-old and your efficiency numbers are through the roof, there's a lot of reason to be excited there. So I think it stands to reason that even in a year that was disappointing from a win and loss perspective, like I would argue the ceiling is higher. Now it's going to take a lot of things to achieve that ceiling. Don't get me wrong. The Pacers they're going to want to double their win total at some point. So they've got a long way to go. But you've got a player who's 22 years old, who will be under team control for a long time, who, has talked about being a Midwest kid at heart and wants the opportunity to have, kind of his team and all those things the Pacers are. So you have that most intriguing player probably since Paul George. You're talking 12 years or so when you drafted him. And then also you have your most intriguing draft pick number-wise that you've had in a very, very long time, since before either you or I have been born. And so I think when you combine those two things, it's tough to know how they go about this, but I think this is as intriguing of a point as this franchise has been in a long time because of what they could be. That's not to suggest that all of a sudden they're going to turn it around and have this massive surge in the next couple of years. It's going to take work and making a lot of right decisions to get there. But they're in a polar opposite position in a lot of ways from where they were when they entered the season, which was, can a lot of good players come together and make a very good team? They're in kind of the opposite spot now, but I think that's exciting too. I think you've got a player in Halliburton that has the potential to be much better than any of those, other guys that the Pacers have had since Paul George, and who knows? The expectations for him are high, but I think rightly so.
Yeah, there's he's pretty close to a 90th percentile offensive player, like now, as we're talking.
Too.
Yeah, he's got the stuff, right? And Duarte, we said his name today. Like he's also pretty damn good, pretty damn good after 1 year. So I think to kind of tie it together with the Fever stuff we just talked about, from a cap door perspective, especially for me, like one down year for the Pacers would be really big for them in terms of setting up sort of this like awesome progression in the Halliburton era where they do the thing the Fever are trying, where they say, yeah, improvement. We're going to improve every year and then we're going to be good. But Halliburton's like that dude now, right now. And so, yeah, obviously they did not have a good record with him on the team, but they also had like a bunch of new guys and G League players playing like 90% of their minutes, right? Like, no offense to those dudes, they all earned the NBA time, but they weren't a good roster around him. Like they're not far from making a jump to me, and not a double their win jump, but a jump of some kind. So I'm kind of torn on how they navigate this, and the lottery will kind of dictate a lot of opinions about it. And I know that's dumb to say because we're both just kind of going, yeah, we'll see in a month. But, it's kind of where they're at, given how good he is and given the options that they have in front of them, that they could kind of go either direction and steer the boat. But the Fever blueprint, not a bad idea to me. But also Tyrese Halliburton might be an all-star like kind of soon. So you got to kind of capitalize on that when you can.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a good way to sum all of this up is when you think about, okay, if you were going to move Domantas Sabonis, where there were a million potential trades out there, who knows if any of them were realistic or not. But I think a lot of people saw the Pacers either getting something like a high draft pick or two, or a different, more established player in the league. And what you hit on, I think, which was dead on, is they kind of got both. Like they've got a guy who's ready to be that good right now, but he's also 22. So so it allows you to pick either of those paths or any variation of those things. You obviously want to make the playoffs as soon as possible, but you also want to build in a way that allows you to do more than just make the playoffs. So yeah, they've got a guy right now who's ready to be a star. And if they want to go, something more along the lines of getting a ton of assets like the Fever did and trying to, hit in the draft, I think they've got that opportunity. Even though the Cleveland pick didn't convey this year, they still very well could have a first rounder in 2023, or as you said, you can still use that pick as trade bait too. So yeah, it's fascinating to see because I think a lot of us said, well, if they're going to make a big move, we're going to instantly know the direction of the franchise, right? Because you're either going to get a really established guy for somebody like Sabonis, or you're going to get a couple of really high picks, or at least one high pick, and you kind of got the best of both worlds there, which only adds to the intrigue.
It does. And for me, a team building loser, I'm kind of like, dang, I don't know what they're doing. I want to project. I want to know, dang it, I want to know what they're doing. It'll all be very fascinating to break down. And of course, we'll cover it all here on Locked On Pacers or on the Fever side. Locked On Women's Basketball now officially going 5 days a week with the crew at the Next. It's been very exciting as camps are ramping up for the W's. We've got coverage from every market over there. Pat, I'm sure everybody who knows who I am also knows who you are, but where can people find you and all of your work with the Pacers and the Fever?
No, I appreciate this, especially because on the Fever side, we kind of started to try something new last year. I'm a huge fan of it, and I'm glad that we're going to be able to bring it back, which is broadcasting all games, home and road, absolutely free. So we're doing the road games, basically how Chris and Quinn did Pacers the last season remotely. We'll be doing the home games in person, which means every single of the 36 Fever games this year. We want you to come out. By the way, they'll be at Gainbridge Fieldhouse here in early May, and feverbasketball.com is how you can purchase tickets. But if you can't, all you're going to have to do, a handful of these games will be on Bally Sports like they always are, but they're going to be streamed to our Facebook page, to our website, I believe into the app as well. Costs you nothing. All you have to do is follow the Fever on social media. And like we've been talking about here, I've said this numerous times, if you've interest in joining the WNBA or as a fan, or just have a little bit of intrigue as to what it might be, like this is the perfect time to get on board with a team. If you want to watch somebody, a team try to navigate its way from the bottom to the top that just has had a ton of assets and will continue to have a ton of young, exciting assets and players, this is the perfect time. So, yep, we'll have all the broadcasts for you. Super excited to have those. And the season tips off May 6th. We're on the road. May 8th, the first home game. So a little bit of a break between the two seasons, but we'll be right back at it here sooner rather than later.
Yeah, it's perfect. I can watch the game 10 feet in front of me and then also have it on my computer via the Facebook link so I get a nice 5-second broadcast delay as I have for seasons and seasons. And I agree. If you've ever thought about getting into the Fever and the W, not only is it a good time because it always is a good time, but also if you're intimidated by the fact that you know nothing about the W, the Fever don't even know who they are yet because they have 22 players in camp and they have to cut them all in the next couple of weeks. So it's going to be fascinating to see it break out, and you'll also get to see a new team grow together. Pat, thank you very much for the time. Everybody, you can check out the Sideline Guys podcast to hear him talk with Jeremiah Johnson about the Pacers weekly. I don't know if they're continuing that in the offseason. I should have asked you that before I said that. But yes, that as well. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about what to watch for in the playoffs from a Pacers perspective. It's already started, but I didn't have time to do it beforehand. So stay tuned for that. Thank you guys a ton for listening, and we will see you then.